Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Insha'Allah, today I will tell you what happened to Yaqub alayhi salam after he married Rahel.
Thank you so much, Baba. I was wondering what happened to them all day.
You are so excited. Now listen to me very carefully. In the last episode, you saw how Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam reached the land of Haran and he married the daughters of his uncle Laban. His first wife Leah gave birth to 7 sons and a daughter as well. But Rahel, his second wife, and whom the Prophet was very fond of, was sad as she didn't have a son. She prayed to Allah, who heard her call and responded to her prayer. She then gave birth to a very beautiful son, and they called him Yusuf. Yaqub alayhi salam stayed in Haran and continued working for Laban for 20 years. One day the Prophet met his uncle and asked him to let him go and visit his family. "I have been blessed because of you," said Laban. "Ask for whatever you need. Give me each speckled, spotted and black lambs that will be born this year," said Yaqub alayhi salam. Laban agreed, and the Prophet walked away happily. But Laban was not willing to part with the sheep he owned, even though it was Yaqub alayhi salam who took care of them. He asked his sons to take away all the speckled, spotted and black sheep from the flock. When Yaqub alayhi salam had gone out for work, the sons of Laban came and they took all the speckled, spotted and the black sheep away. When Yaqub alayhi salam returned that evening, he realized that he had been tricked by his uncle. But in spite of Laban's tricks, when the sheep bred, many of them were born black. This was a miracle. When Laban saw this, he was both surprised and angry at the Prophet, as he had promised all the black lambs to Yaqub alayhi salam. One day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked the Prophet to return to his country. The Prophet told his wives and children and prepared to leave Haran. He took everything that belonged to him, including the spotted and black lambs. The Prophet did not tell Laban about his plans and left without bidding him farewell. The next morning, Laban realized that Yaqub alayhi salam had taken all his belongings and left the land. He was very angry. He took all his people and started following Yaqub alayhi salam. They traveled for many days and nights following Yaqub alayhi salam. And finally, they caught up with the Prophet. "Why did you leave without my knowledge?" asked Laban. "If you had told me that you were leaving, we could have celebrated this occasion with a feast, and I could have bid farewell to my daughters as well." The Prophet talked to Laban, and it was decided that they will part ways. They sat on a hill called Gilead, and they made a covenant there. It was decided that neither of them would enter the land of the other from that day. All of them then ate the food together. Then each bade the other farewell. As they departed, each returning to his own country. The Prophet and his family walked. then started traveling towards his country. One day at the break of dawn, the Prophet was sitting outside his tent when an angel appeared before him in the shape of a man. Then the angel started to wrestle with the Prophet. They fought neck to neck until the angel injured the Prophet's thigh, and the Prophet became lame. The sun had started rising up by now, and the angel asked him, "What is your name?" "Yaqub," replied the Prophet. "From this day you shall be called Israel," said the angel, and vanished into thin air. The Prophet could not believe his eyes, and he realized that the man was actually an angel. They then continued traveling for many days. When the Prophet reached the land of Seir, he sent a messenger ahead to Esau asking forgiveness. The next day, the messenger returned with the news that Esau was riding towards him with some 400 men. The Prophet was afraid, so he prayed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, seeking his help. The Prophet then prepared a great present for his brother. He asked his servants to take 200 goats, 200 ewes, 30 camels, and many other animals along with them. He asked them to go ahead before him. "When you meet my brother," he said, "he will ask you who you are, and you should say they belong to your servant Yaqub, and the animals are the present for his master Esau." The slaves did as they were asked to and went ahead of the Prophet. After 2 days, the Prophet then traveled towards his country. Esau was riding with his men when he met the slaves of Yaqub alayhi salam. He was very impressed when the slaves told him that the animals were a gift from his brother. When the Prophet saw his brother coming, he prostrated to him as a sign of salutation. Esau was quite moved when he saw this, so he ran towards him and embraced him. Esau even wept when he saw his brother. "Who are these people with you?" asked Esau when he saw the women and children. "They were given to me by our God," said the Prophet humbly. Leah, Rahel, the children, and all his slaves came and prostrated before Esau as a sign of respect. Esau refused to accept the gifts at first, but the Prophet insisted and he had to accept them at last. All of them started traveling back to their country, and they were led by none other than Esau. On their way back, the Prophet camped near Jerusalem. It was here that the Prophet had poured the oil on a rock years ago. He then built a mosque as he had promised. The Prophet then traveled to Hebron and met his father, Prophet Ishaq alayhi salam. The old Prophet was really happy when he met his son after a long time. Prophet Ishaq alayhi salam died after some time at the age of 180 years old, and they buried him next to their grandfather Ibrahim alayhi salam. Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam had 12 sons in total, and Yusuf was one among them. He grew up into a handsome and devoted man. They migrated to Egypt, and they lived there for 17 years. And after living and preaching about God for a long time, the Prophet died at the age of 147.
MashaAllah, it was such a great story.
I'm glad you liked it, my son. Now I shall ask you a few questions from the story.
I'm ready.
Very good. Now here is the first question. Who was the uncle of Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam who lived in Haran?
Ha! I know the answer. It was Laban.
MashaAllah, that's correct. Who did the Prophet fall in love with?
The Prophet fell in love with Rahel.
That's correct again. Now tell me, what did the Prophet ask his uncle before returning home?
The Prophet asked for the speckled, spotted, and the black sheep from the herd.
That's right again. What was the name that the angel gave the Prophet after wrestling with him?
It was Israel.
That's correct. Who was the Prophet's favorite son?
It was Yusuf.
That's right again. And now for the last question. How old was the Prophet when he died?
The Prophet was 147 years old when he died.
MashaAllah, you gave me all the right answers, my son. You are such a brilliant boy.
Thank you, Baba.
That's all for today. Insha'Allah, I will tell you the story of Prophet Shu'aib alayhi salam tomorrow. Good night, my son.
Good night, Baba.